Today's talk will focus on the illumination of Qur'ans and other Islamic manuscripts, and we're delighted to have Dr. Annabel Gallop, who's the lead curator for the Southeast Asia at the British Library.
So tonight I'm going to be talking on art and artists in Malay manuscript books. And among the delights that you'll see in the exhibition, and I hope all of you will go and have a look at the exhibition if you haven't been already, shown here are some of the finely illuminated copies of seminal Malay literary works, such as Hikayat Iskandar Zulkarnain, Syair Kentambuhan, and Tajus Salatin from the collections of the British Library, the Royal Asiatic Society, and Leiden University Library, which are now in Singapore. When I started working at the British Library in 1986, perhaps long before many of you were born, as curator for the Malay and Indonesian collections, I was especially enchanted by the beautiful ornamental frames sometimes found on opening pages. And one of my first publications for the British Library Journal was a listing of all the decorated Malay manuscripts in the British Library. And in connection with the exhibition Golden Letters, Writing Traditions of Indonesia in 1991, I traveled all over the UK, armed with the indispensable catalogue of Indonesian manuscripts in Great Britain by Rickleff and Voorhoeven. And I think I managed to see every single illuminated Malay manuscript in the country. And on frequent visits to Holland and also to Malaysia and Indonesia, I also documented all the decorated Malay manuscripts I could find. This was a very exciting project because most of the earlier, extremely erudite scholars of Malay literature, such as Wilkinson and Winstead, who had read more hikayat and syair than I could even begin to list, tended to focus purely on the contents of the texts, but had no discernible interest in the aesthetics of the manuscripts themselves. However, to me, there was a real art historical problem with all this beautiful material I had gathered. However long I studied and looked at manuscripts as beautiful as this, I couldn't discern any patterns or groupings or trends that seemed to make artistic sense. And it was only about 10 years later that the penny finally dropped. I had been looking in the wrong place with the wrong eyes. Or rather, I was a victim of my education and of the European classical philological tradition that had privileged original literary compositions in vernacular languages and studied them more or less divorced from the intellectual and cultural contexts in which they had been produced. In this case, the elephant in the room was Arabic. Thus, the exemplary catalogue by Rickleff and Voorhoeven, listing all the manuscripts in the UK in Indonesian languages such as Malay, Javanese, Balinese, Batak, and Makassar, does not include manuscripts in Arabic from Southeast Asia. Courses in Malay literature and Malay manuscripts, such as those at SOAS and Leiden, are usually taught without constant cognition of the fact that the vast majority of manuscripts produced in the Malay world were Islamic texts, often written in Arabic or in Arabic and Malay. And in fact, the most beautiful examples of manuscript art in the Malay world are found not in literary texts such as these, but in religious texts. And at the pinnacle, of course, is the Qur'an. I hope I'd hear an intake of wow when I put up this slide. It does it to me. I think this is one of the most beautiful Qur'an manuscripts from Southeast Asia I've ever seen. It's produced in Terengganu, and it's in a private collection in Terengganu now. So in copies of the Qur'an in the Malay world, manuscript illumination reaches peaks not seen in literary manuscripts. And these examples of manuscript art are also found in considerable quantities. Over 600 illuminated Qur'an manuscripts from Southeast Asia have now been documented, let alone other religious works. And a study of this corpus very quickly yielded exactly the sorts of patterns and shapes that I had been hoping to find, but had not encountered earlier. Thus, distinctive schools of manuscript art can be identified in certain regional locations, for example, most prominently in Aceh. So this is a very typical example of a Qur'an manuscript from Aceh, an illuminated Qur'an manuscript. And the Achenese style of illumination can be defined very clearly in terms of the architecture of the decorated frames. The vertical borders always extend upwards and downwards beyond the limits of the rectangular frames around the text. And on the three outer sides of each page are always arches, while those on the vertical sides are flanked by a pair of tendrils or wings. I don't know if you can see, but on the arch on the vertical side, there are two little tendrils on each flanking the arch. The palette in Achenese manuscripts is strongly based on red, yellow, black, and reserved white, which is the color of the background paper, not white pigment or white paint, but the color of the paper, which has been left uncolored. And reserved white is always accorded the main role of carrying the motif. Gold is never used in Achenese Qur'an manuscripts. Now, probably over 200 or so illuminated Achenese Qur'an manuscripts have been identified so far, evincing diversity in unity, with minor palette variations, but an astonishing degree of compliance with the architectural strictures of the style. And yet there is still room for individuality. While nearly all Southeast Asian Qur'an manuscripts share a preference for organic vegetal forms over geometric motifs, here is one manuscript which completely bucks the trend. The artist in this case has opted for a dramatically geometrical presentation, although in every other aspect of shape and palette, it conforms to the expected conventions of the Achenese style. So just as I've defined the salient features of the Achenese style of Quranic illumination, similar clusters of certain other regional schools of art can be identified, including along the east coast of the Malay Peninsula, with loci in Terengganu with a highly accomplished, professional, and densely worked style, and a smaller, slightly more spare, but individualistic and exquisitely well-balanced form associated with Patani and Kelantan. And all along the East Coast, we find a particular artistic focus on the marginal ornaments which mark divisions of the Quranic text into 30 equal parts known as juz, or divisions thereof. And some manuscripts may have nearly 100 such marginal ornaments, every single one uniquely realized. Now, other regional Quranic styles of illumination can be associated with the Sulawesi diaspora and with different parts of Java. So gradually a sort of picture begins to emerge of different schools of Quranic art throughout the archipelago, not everywhere, not always where you might expect, but in certain clearly defined locales. Moving on to other religious manuscripts, we find that, albeit within highly stylized parameters, representational art can be found in certain genres of Malay manuscripts. In particular, Kitab Maulid, songs and verses in praise of the Prophet. These drawings normally comprise schematic depictions of Mecca and Medina, the holy cities, as in this particular manuscript from Terengganu. And in this one from Aceh, which on the right shows the Kaaba in Mecca, and on the left the tombs of the Prophet and his companions, which are represented in a very schematic style with three rectangular oblongs. And also in this exquisite little manuscript from Patani, which has on the left a stylized representation of the pulpit, the mimbar of the Prophet, and on the right, the three gold rectangles represent the tombs of the Prophet and his two companions. This exquisite little manuscript from Patani was included in the Great British Museum exhibition on the Hajj in 2012 and was displayed in a case alongside a superb Mamluk brass candlestick on loan from the Benaki Museum in Athens. I was so moved to see this little manuscript on display in London, making the point that Malay art was at last being given due international recognition as an integral component of Islamic art. With the regional mapping of the manuscript art of the archipelago, returning now to Malay literary manuscripts, even the variation and individuality of artistic forms within this corpus begins now to make some sort of sense. A linking factor seems not to be so much one of content, but rather the creation of these manuscripts outside established centers of religious manuscript art, such as Aceh and the east coast of the peninsula. And instead, we see a connection with the cosmopolitan burgeoning urban centers, such as Penang, Malacca, and Batavia. So having now established some broad regional parameters in the study of Malay manuscript art, in some cases it is possible to progress further and identify individual manuscripts decorated by the same artist. Sometimes the connections are easily identifiable, as in this pair of charming sha'ir from the Leiden University Library collection, which you can see in the exhibition, which are both associated with the exiled Sultan Mahmud Badaruddin of Palembang in Ternate. So although these manuscripts were acquired from Ternate, they have certain features, the use of that blue in particular, which really reflects their Palembang provenance. In other cases, it is purely visual congruences, which serve to link manuscripts currently held in different collections and even on different continents, such as in these two Qur'an manuscripts from Aceh, which are evidently the work of the same illuminator and possibly even the same scribe. So the one on the left is held in the Museum Negeri Aceh, and that on the right is in Rotterdam in the Wereld Museum. And neither of them give any information about the name of the scribe or the artist or the owner, but on purely visual and graphic similarities, they can be linked as originating from the same artistic stable. And in the case of this pair of manuscripts, despite the clear difference in motifs, both manuscripts share the same palette of red and green and a compositional unity in the outer red border hugging the edge of the pages in both manuscripts. And I will come back to this pair of manuscripts later today. But who are the artists behind these books? In many Malay manuscripts, we find the scribe named. When we have the name of a scribe, can we assume that they also decorated the book? As in this case of another manuscript shown downstairs, Hikayat Parang Puting, which was copied by Ibrahim, who was the chief scribe of Raffles. And it's very, very rare to have an image, a portrait of a Malay scribe, but we do have one of Ibrahim, so we can see exactly what he looks like. But the short answer is no, we cannot assume that the scribe necessarily decorated the manuscript he copied unless there is some other corroborative contextual evidence. In just one or two manuscripts, we do find tiny hints of who the artist might have been. For example, in this manuscript of Hikayat Charang Kulina from the Dewan Bahasa collection in Kuala Lumpur, and this is a well-known Panji story in Malay, we find a very small inscription at the tip of each of the 4 pillars of the decorated frames. In each case, all 4 cases, the inscription reads, Megat Anum Empunya. Megat Anum is the owner. But does this mean Megat Anum was the owner of the book? Or does it mean Megat Anum was the one responsible for the decoration? The latter possibility does seem very likely in this case due to the close integration of the name into the design, but we still cannot be categorical. In the case of another illuminated manuscript also shown in the exhibition downstairs, which I hope you will now all recognize after your quick lesson earlier as being in the Aceh style, and this is a manuscript which comes from the very valuable collection donated recently to the National Library of Singapore by Dr. Farish Noor. The first page of the manuscript bears a detailed colophon in both Arabic and Malay, which is dated 1236, equivalent to 1820 or 1821, and it names both the owner, Tengku Muda Jalung, and the scribe, Lebay Abdul Karim of Lamui. But my interest is in the words used to identify the scribe. The colophon is given both in Arabic, in the main body of the text, and in Malay, diagonally in the border. So in Arabic, you can see highlighted in red in the middle, wa katibuhu, and then a rather unusual word which seems to read wa raka'uhu. Now, that's not actually an Arabic word, but the Malay in the border reads yang menyuratnya dan yang mereka, and at that point it gets cut off, but it seems quite close, yang merekahnya. Now, rekah is a Malay loanword from Sanskrit, meaning to arrange or to compose. And in this particular case, it's saying that the person who wrote this, who copied out, the scribe who copied this manuscript, and who arranged it. Now, there's a degree of ambiguity. It could mean the person who composed the text, but it would be rather strange to use that word in Arabic. And I have an instinct that it might mean the person who decorated the manuscript, which, if so, would be a very, very unusual thing to find, piece of information to find in a Malay manuscript. So it becomes quite clear that at this stage, what we really need to investigate is the traditional Malay vocabulary for drawing and decorating. And for this, we turn to the invaluable Malay Concordance project put together by the late great Ian Proudfoot, in which you can search for individual Malay words and see how they were used in traditional Malay texts. So an investigation using the Malay Concordance project and looking at a wide range of textual references to decorating and painting and drawing yields the following terms. Most of these words may seem initially familiar, but what is very striking is the evolution in meaning over time. For example, today, peta is the standard word for map, but in traditional Malay texts, it didn't mean that. It simply meant picture. Perhaps most striking of all is that the standard word to draw is not the present-day lukis, melukis, but tulis, menulis, which in contemporary usage generally only means to write. In traditional Malay texts, tulis can mean to write, but it's very rarely used. Much more common is the term surat or menurat. And so shown here are some examples. I don't know if you can read them, but from the Malay Concordance Project, showing the use of the term menulis in early Malay texts like Hikayat Raja Pasai and Hikayat Sri Rama. So one of them reads at the bottom, so Sri Rama asks, in the Ramayana, in the Hikayat Sri Rama, someone very mischievous draws a picture of Ravana on the fan of the sleeping Sita Dewi, and Rama asks, siapa yang menulis rupa Maharaja Rawana pada kipas ini? Who drew the picture of Rawana on Sita Dewi's fan? So menulis is used for draw. Now, tulis is, of course, an old Javanese word that occurs already in 12th century texts for decorating cloth. And, of course, even today, most people who have ever bought a sarong are aware of the distinction between batik cap and batik tulis. And thus we find in a famous passage in the Sejarah Melayu, when Hang Nadim is sent to India to order cloth for the Sultan, he sketches on a piece of paper for the Indian designers the motifs he had in mind. Maka oleh Hang Nadim ditulisnyalah pada kertas bunga yang seperti kehendak hatinya itu. So bunga is the word for motif or pattern. And the Indian artists called in the Sejarah Melayu pandai menulis. Pandai is a very elevated term meaning a master craftsman, someone who, like you'd say, pandai besi was a master blacksmith, so pandai menulis, the great artists watch. And they are, of course, astonished at his skill in drawing. And in the great unfinished dictionary of Malay, compiled by Raja Ali Haji, which he only gets as far as the first 5 letters of the alphabet, but happily that includes the letter ta, he defines tulis as the term for inscribing both letters or various kinds of patterns. So now I would like to turn back to this wonderful manuscript of Hikayat Nabi Yusuf from the British Library, which is here on display downstairs, one of my favorite manuscripts, which was copied by Muhammad Labai in 1802 and which has traveled all the way from London for this exhibition. I first started looking at this manuscript more closely in conjunction with a workshop convened by Jan van der Putten at Hamburg University on paratexts in Malay manuscripts. Paratexts can be understood as any textual and graphic elements which supplement the main text in the form of notes, annotations, ownership marks, decorations, or even just doodles. This manuscript is very rich in paratexts, and as I started reading them all systematically, in one note which named the owner of this manuscript as Chitchandra, and it also, in a very conventional way, asks any readers to take care of the book, the last line actually gave me quite a jolt. It says, "Karena banyak sangat senda," senda means eye, "rugi menuli kepalanya." Now, menuli can be understood because this manuscript was acquired in Penang, and menuli is the northern dialect form of menulis. As for kepalanya, again by reference to batik, it can be understood as the decoration at the head of the book. And so I realized that this was a note by the artist himself about the illuminated frontispiece at the beginning of the book. Now, if we go back to the illuminated pages, there are 2 small paratextual notes at the top of the illuminated frames. And I've known this manuscript for 20 years, and I described it in my first published note on decorated Malay manuscripts, and I had always understood these notes to refer to the writing of the book. Now at last, finally, after 20 years, I began to realize they were not referring to the writing of the book, but to the decorating, the illuminating of the book. On the left, the note reads, Inilah tulisan Cip Mat Tok Muda, Anak Raja Indra Wangsa di Perlis. This is the writing of Cip Mat Tok Muda, but this is the drawing of Cip Mat Tok Muda, the son of Raja Indra Wangsa in Perlis. And on the right, the note reads, Inilah bekas tangan Cip Mat, orang Kayangan dipinjam oleh Cik Chandra. This is the handiwork of Cip Mat from Kayangan, loaned to Cik Chandra. Cik Chandra being the owner of the book who had commissioned the writing and decorating of the manuscript. So in this case, we have the artist of the illumination identifying himself on the page with it, so signing his work. I'd now like to turn to the sister manuscript of this, of the Hikayat Nabi Yusuf, which is a copy of the Hikayat Shahi Mardan in the Royal Asiatic Society in London. Now, this manuscript was actually copied by a completely different scribe, Imam Alang, who's named in the colophon. But we find in this book a similarly rich trove of paratexts, of notes and annotations which surround the main story, including a self-deprecatory declaration by the artist himself, Cip Muhammad, belittling his artistic prowess in time-honored Malay modesty. So he writes, Cip Muhammad is the one responsible for the illumination at the start of this book. So Cip Muhammad lah yang empunya tulisan di kepalanya surat ini. So the illumination has been entrusted to or loaned to or borrowed by the book's owner, Cik Chandra. And he says, this is just a sample of my drawing because I'm not very skillful, and moreover, I'm in a melancholic state, and that is why it is not very fine. This is a very, very typical Malay self-effacing apology for any shortcomings that you would find in almost any work of art. So the important point is the first line where, again, the artist identifies himself. But even more fascinating, in another note on another page in the book, the artist gives the name of the design. So he reads, Maka yang menulisnya di kepala surat ini, nama tulisnya, Kucing bertenung. Now, Kucing is again the dialect form Kuching from the north. So the name of the design is the thinking cat. Now, I'm not sure I can see any cat references, but I'll leave that to your imagination. And so we have these two manuscripts, both written circa 1800. The Hikayat Shahi Mardan is a bit earlier, by 1790, commissioned and owned by the same man, Cik Chandra, copied by different scribes, but both illuminated by Cip Muhammad Datuk Muda, son of Raja Indra Wangsa of Kayangan in Perlis, who I believe is the first firmly identified Malay manuscript artist. So this is the artist I had in mind to highlight when I was first invited to give this talk, and I planned it in connection with the manuscripts we were bringing from London. But as this exhibition covers not only manuscripts, but also early Malay printed books and lithographs, which are rooted in the manuscript tradition, I would like to sort of point towards or indicate another Malay artist whose name will be much more familiar to you than Datuk Muda Muhammad of Perlis. Although it must be admitted that Singapore is a peripheral player in the world of Malay manuscripts, it moves to center stage in the era of printing, when it became the world center for Malay publishing in the second half of the 19th century. In the earliest days, printing was more or less restricted to government agencies and the mission presses, initially just using movable type, but by the 1830s, lithography had been brought to the island by the American mission press. The key player in this story was Benjamin Peach Keysbury, a missionary who was crucially also an artist, who arrived in Singapore in 1839 and spent the rest of his life working on the island until his death in 1875. Among his letters back to his board, the London Missionary Society, and which are still held in the LMS archives at SOAS in London, are a few sketches of Singapore, which he lithographed onto his letters to show the practical value of the lithographic press, for which he was constantly having to ask his bosses for more money for. And I must acknowledge the wonderful help of Jan van der Putten, who was the first one who discovered these drawings in the LMS archive and who kindly gave me copies. So this is a very early drawing of Singapore by Benjamin Peach Keysbury, and you might be able to see on the tiny on the bottom on the left, it's lith by, i.e. lithographed by, and on the right, the initials BPK. And here's another drawing from one of his letters, and his initials BPK in the corner of in the bottom right-hand corner. Keysbury was very well aware of the advantages of lithography for mimicking the Malay manuscript tradition. And under Keysbury's artistic eye, the Singapore Mission Press produced some of the most beautiful early Malay books ever printed. I started looking at these books again a few months ago for a workshop on lithography organized by Jan in Hamburg. And I expected my paper, which was on the decorative elements in early Malay lithographs, to be mostly about Keysbury, who I assumed was the artist responsible for most of these decorated elements. After all, it was quite evident that Keysbury illustrated himself many of the early mission imprints in Malay, and some of the earliest ones bear his initials. You can see, again, lithographed by BPK in this one. And on the left is another very obvious example of Keysbury's artwork. But when I looked at the corpus of material more closely, I was taken aback by just how many of the most attractive decorated books were works by Munsyi Abdullah. And this is the name which I knew would ring many bells around the audience, not least because of the wonderful work by my very good friend, Professor Hashim. For example, Hikayat Galila dan Damina, printed in around 1840, has attractive rectangular floral frames in rust red, which may indeed be the very first example of chromolithography or color lithography in Southeast Asia. While Syair Singapura Terbakar of 1843 also has attractive red floral borders, and Syair Kampung Gelam Terbakar of 1847 was printed in scroll form with a decorated headpiece. And of course, the great Hikayat Abdullah of 1849, the first deluxe book printed in Singapore, and perhaps the finest Malay 19th century imprint, has beautiful initial frames printed in 3 colors. While Cerita dari Hal Haji Sabar Ali in 1851, the account of a notorious murder trial, has a decorative title panel and a facing portrait of Haji Sabar Ali. Now, I had always assumed that the portrait and the decoration of this book in particular were by Benjamin Peach Keysbury. Keysbury's drawings are very characterized by very heavy hashwork and very dense lines and hashes. But certainly it was Abdullah himself who wrote the text, and the beautiful decorative title panel is so closely entwined with the decorative cartouche that it probably stands to reason that it was Abdullah himself who was responsible, at least for the title panel. After all, we know that Abdullah was an artist. In the Hikayat Abdullah, there is a famous episode when he describes how he earned money when he was small by decorating kites for little children. And he mentions how he learned to draw in Malacca as a young boy by watching the Chinese drawing pictures and patterns. And he set up in business, and he says how successful he was because he offered blank paper kites, which he could then personalize and customize and draw children any drawing they wanted, whereas the other kite makers were only sticking on sort of random bits of colored paper to make their patterns. But he could draw elephants or a bird or a fish. Quite a bit later, when he was an adult, we have a Malay letter from Abdullah to his friend and colleague Edouard Dulaurier in Paris. And Abdullah writes to him and asks him, saying, "I would like to ask you to buy me a pattern book for drawing designs because I want some examples to copy, and also for a box of inks or paints in various colors for decorating these patterns." So there is a running thread through Abdullah's work. He was an artist. So I then started looking in a bit more detail at the decorative motifs in books known to have been copied by Abdullah and those known to have been illustrated by Keysbury. And on the basis of a very preliminary survey, and perhaps this is a topic for a more detailed topic for an art student, I believe that Keysbury's decoration, as seen on the right, however simple, is fundamentally three-dimensional, whereas much of the work in Abdullah's books is presented in a two-dimensional flat plane. It's a very, very profound difference. So if we can tentatively ascribe most of the ornamental elements in Abdullah's works to the author himself, albeit enabled through his artistic collaboration with Keysbury, while the decorative frames on the opening pages, which I showed earlier, are essentially within the Malay idiom, the elaborate calligraphic section headings set in ornamental cartouches, which are found throughout the Hikayat Abdullah on almost every few pages, these are profoundly new and original within the world of Malay manuscript books. I have never seen a Malay manuscript book with section headings as decorative as those in the Hikayat Abdullah. Even in the finest Qur'an manuscripts, they are inevitably constrained within rectangular frames. So, in addition to Abdullah's many pioneering roles, he has been called Khadija has called him the father of modern Malay literature. When I first started working on printing, I called him the father of Malay printing. I think we could now also acknowledge him as the father of early Malay book decoration and suggest that the art history of Singapore may actually have its origins in early Malay book decoration. So thank you very much.
Is there a methodology that's followed in terms of creating these drawings? Do you know anything about like the process that might have gone into educating oneself in this?
The short answer is no. There is nothing written. There are no Malay manuals of painting, of book decoration, of illumination, which is different from the case, say, for Persian and Turkish works. We do have there, you do have manuals about how artists mixed colors and things like that. There's absolutely nothing written in Malay, nor do we even have foreign accounts, eyewitness accounts of how artists worked in the Malay world. So what we are forced to do is simply to rely on the primary material itself, to look at an illuminated manuscript and look at it very, very closely and try and work out how the artist worked. Some mechanical tools were used. Circles were drawn with a compass, for example. But very skilled artists, you can find that there's no use of pencil. The outlines were done in black ink straight away. So you have to use your eye. You have to look very, very closely at the manuscripts and just work it out from first principles.
Thank you, Dr. Annabel. That was a brilliant talk, and the examples you showed were absolutely exquisite. I have two questions. Is that all right? Okay, so my first question is, I know I've asked you about whether the Malay illuminators were inspired by the other traditions, or rather, did they borrow from book book illumination traditions, but do you see them as engaging in a sort of dialogue through their work with, the Timurid or the Arabian book art traditions? Because I mean, there's definitely a lot of exchange going on, and the Malays were not just producing, but they were certainly consuming a lot of Islamic books from the rest of the Islamic world. So that's my first question. My second question is, how significantly different is the art of book illumination from the art of letter illumination, Malay royal letters?
For the first question, the degree of engagement and influence, I mean, as a the general principles of Islamic decoration and illumination are absolutely conformed to throughout the Malay world, which is essentially the primacy of the double-page spread, which is fundamentally Islamic. It's not European, it's not Christian. If you have manuscripts of the four Gospels, for example, medieval manuscripts, you will find a very heavily decorated page on the right-hand side of an opening on what is the first page of the manuscript. But in Islamic works, you take the double-page spread as the basic artistic unit, and there's a principle of symmetrical decoration around the gutter. So that is what sort of essentially links Malay Islamic illumination with all other forms of Islamic illumination. But in terms of detail, not an enormous amount, but it does vary very much from place to place. So on parts of the east coast in Terengganu, Patani, you do see a little bit of Ottoman, recognition of Ottoman. There's something, I don't know how you pronounce it in Turkish, called Tig or Turk, which are the tiny little spires that go out around the edge of a design. And you see these in some East Coast illumination. But for example, somewhere like Aceh, it's hard to see where any other influence is coming from. It's very useful to study the illumination of Qur'ans because they are treated with so much respect. They are very conventionalized. People, on the whole, didn't dare to exert their personality and introduce changes. So that's where you can really study a regional style. But then you don't see so many outside influences coming in. In some manuscripts from Java, you see some Chinese motifs. The sort of bungee or swastika motif is very clearly seen on some Qur'an manuscripts only from Java. So again, these things are regionally determined. The other question about illumination in letters and books, it's entirely different. And even on the whole, between religious manuscripts and the literary manuscripts, they're very different. But between letters, it's completely different.
Thank you again for a marvelous talk. I was wondering whether some of the motifs would be linked to other art forms such as architecture, woodwork, carvings, and so on, if you've studied that as well.
I mean, that's an extremely interesting question and one I've long pondered. And again, I'm very, very, I tend to be very careful in making links. But I think probably of all the art forms, I mean, wood carving in some places tends to be one of the closest, affords the closest parallels. And for example, certainly in Acehese manuscripts, there's a very, very distinctive motif only found in Aceh of a plaited rope, and I've seen that on wood carving in Aceh as well. A good friend and colleague, Dr. Rosmawati from Malaysia, did suggest that maybe one reason for the perhaps the links between wood carving and manuscript illumination might have been that wood carvers also had to sketch their designs first. I think the interesting thing is that on the whole, in the Malay world, apart from perhaps with the sole exception of Terengganu, where the art form was raised to heights not achieved anywhere else in the Malay world, on the whole, it wasn't atelier or it wasn't specialized production. You don't get the feeling you're working with professional artists. Most of the manuscripts are produced in communities where the people who produced them would have been doing other things as well. So they would have drawn on other things that they might have done, but were never, they didn't earn their living from decorating manuscripts. There wasn't enough trade in that line of business to that. And so that's why you don't always see very clear patterns of influence with other art forms, I think.
Hi, Doctor. Good evening. What or who originally inspired you to research on all this?
I think I've just been so lucky to have had such a lovely job. I sort of feel with my job as curator of, Indonesian and Malay collections, I'm like a kid in a candy shop, There's all this wonderful material, and it's part of my job to work on it, sort of what more could you ask? But I think also, one thing is that I've just been astonished. I mean, I find these things so beautiful, and I was just astonished the fact that earlier scholars only concentrated on the text. I mean, I have to say it's a much easier job just looking at pictures and having to read every single line of Jawi in a difficult manuscript, so maybe I've just gone for the easy option. But obviously it meant that I did feel that I was doing something new, and that anything I did, even the very basic work of just listing and identifying illuminated manuscripts was worth doing, and it hopefully would be a help to other people in the future. And then it's getting together with other friends and scholars. The last part of my talk about Munsyi Abdullah wasn't actually part of the plan. It was only because I attended a workshop in Hamburg just 2 months ago. I thought, oh yes, maybe Abdullah did the work himself. So, it continues all the time like that. Thank you.
I was just staring at the piece and was curious about how the top one, the calligraphy, ended with floral motifs. Is that common? Because I'm not a scholar of calligraphy.
I mean, that's one of so on the top I've shown one of the finest examples of Qur'anic, it's a surah heading from a Qur'an manuscript probably from Terengganu. I mean, it might be a tiny sort of Patani touch, but it's that quality of calligraphy is really only found in Terengganu. You don't find it anywhere else. But it's also quite a good example of what I was mentioning, that the headings in Hikayat Abdullah, which are they look sort of vaguely Islamic, vaguely Oriental, which are very sort of, nice cartouches. Actually, you don't find them in Malay manuscripts. So even the most elaborate Qur'an manuscript, the heading would be set within a very clearly defined rectangular frame. So actually what Munsyi Abdullah was doing in the Hikayat Abdullah was unprecedented in terms of Malay aesthetics. But that ending in like a letter, like a floral tip. I mean, my colleague Ali Akbar in Indonesia, who works on calligraphy, he calls it floral calligraphy, and he finds it quite, I'm not saying necessarily unique, but very unusual, so quite a strong feature in Southeast Asia that's not often encountered elsewhere. Maybe, Alison, do you know if you've seen that in other parts of the Islamic world? The transformation of letters into... Yes, you do find it. So it's not unique, but it's not that common, certainly, even in Southeast Asia.
I'm curious, what was distinctive about Terengganu? Why is it that the illustrations from Terengganu were so much more elaborate than elsewhere in the region?
It's a good question. I mean, Terengganu is well known for its arts throughout, Malaysia. Its wood carving is renowned. Its textiles are renowned. The great Malaysian scholar Tan Sri Mubin Shepherd wrote a book on, the arts, Malay arts, which focused on Terengganu, but he didn't even mention once manuscript illumination, which I really can't quite understand. When I think of the old colonial scholars, I think, well, maybe that's because they were not Muslim and people didn't want to show them Qur'ans, but Tan Sri Mubin Shepherd was a Muslim, and so I really cannot understand why he didn't mention it. It's a good question, and the short answer is we don't know. sort of some areas to explore might be royal patronage, and it could be that there was a particular sultan who encouraged arts at a particular time, because the level of achievement is so high in Terengganu and the materials used are so sumptuous, gold and strong mineral pigments. These are not just vegetal pigments. And as I said, it's the one place which seems to reflect a sort of atelier mode of production. So you have specialized people, specialized calligraphers, specialized illuminators. And what is very clear, which is again quite unique, is that Qur'an manuscripts from Terengganu were exported all over the peninsula. So Qur'an manuscripts from Terengganu have been discovered in royal collections in Palembang, in Pontianak, in Bima on the island of Sumbawa. So it shows that they were appreciated all over. And when the Qur'an was first printed in Singapore and lithographed, the scribes were usually from Terengganu and identified as such in the 1860s. And the Qur'ans which were lithographed in Singapore emulated the Terengganu style of manuscript decoration as well.